welcome to everyone who is tuning in online. My name is Eric Koss. I am on staff with Safe Church Ministry. And if you're not familiar with Safe Church Ministry, we are an agency of the Christian Reformed Church denomination. And it's our mission to equip congregations in abuse awareness, prevention, and response. And we are so glad to have Diane with us today. And we are excited about her new book that we'll talk a little bit more about. It was just released last week. And so this is fresh for so many people to start learning from. And I know I have been so grateful for Diane's voice and all of her material in the past. And we've started to integrate it into some abuse awareness training within Safe Church and abusive power training, especially for new pastors in the Christian. And we have some great videos online. And so we're excited to talk today, Diane. Otherwise, Becky, turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Becky. I'm also part of Safe Church Ministries and a volunteer and communications specialist. And I'm so happy to be part of this. Diane, it's just been wonderful reading your book. It's been so helpful for my own personal journey, so thank you. Just to let everybody know, we are going to be having questions for Diane from Bonnie and Eric, and then we're going to turn it over to you. So what we would like to do is if you could actually just drop questions that you'd like in the chat. We will attempt to get to as many as we can with the time that we have allotted for the question period at the end. Thank you.
All right, and I'm Bonnie Nicholas. I'm the director of Safe Church Ministry for a little while longer, and I'm looking forward to retirement next month. But I'm also thrilled to have Diane, and I'm thrilled that you are all here joining us today. We have a good number of people, and that's exciting to see as well. So Diane is director of Diane Langberg, PhD and Associates outside Philadelphia. She serves on clinical faculty at Biblical Theological Seminary, where she co-leads Trauma Recovery Institute with Phil Monroe. She's the author of many books on topics related to trauma and also related to suffering, and also God's power to overcome. She's a columnist, writes for Christian Counseling Today and many other publications that she's written for. So there's a lot more I could say about Diane, but we are so thrilled to have her today. So join me in welcoming her. Yay. This is the time for applause. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Diane, is, I gave this brief introduction, and there's a lot more that I could have said, but you've been doing trauma work and church work for a long time. And I'm wondering if there is something that doesn't usually show up in introductions, but something about yourself that maybe people don't know so much, but has been a significant part of your life and work. Can you tell us about something about that?
Yes, that was a difficult question, only because I had to make a choice. And part of it is something that's well known, but probably not in detail. As anybody who's read my books probably knows, I grew up the daughter of an Air Force colonel. And I think I went to 8 or 9 schools by the time I graduated from high school. So that tells you something about that life. And I think that one of the things that did for me that I did not recognize until much later in life was train me, teach me to both enjoy and study and respect difference. We were in many places in the US, and as we know, regions in the US often have very different cultures. I spent 2 years of my life in Japan. And of course, I've traveled a lot as an adult now, but I was shy, which is hard to believe now, I suppose, but I was. And I was also very observant about people. I found it fascinating, and I found that differences not threatening, but interesting, and wanting to understand them. And I realized a long time later, when I started entering the country, so to speak, the culture of trauma and abuse, that those skills had been planted in me to some degree very early on, when I had no idea, number one, that that was happening, and number two, the work that I would do. So I've been very grateful for that shaping.
And that
Thanks.
reminds me of part of your book too, where you start to talk about the power dynamics that are at play with different cultures, the one that you find yourself in, and ones that people from different ethnicities are from, and it's interesting. I think we're at a cross section of culture, especially when we're talking about politics in the United States. But your book also discusses how we are easily shaped by culture in which we live and the atmosphere we breathe, how easily we are seduced by deceptive words. What are some of the cultural blind spots, particularly in our current Christian culture, that have influenced you writing this book?
Well, I on the one hand, it's just been very interesting to travel internationally and be involved with Christians all over the world who not only come from different cultures, but also handle culture differently and who have suffered differently than we have in the US. I've been to several places where there's been genocide, for instance, and how that has influenced down through the generations, which has given me insight into the destruction generationally of slavery in the United States. Something I probably would not have understood, at least as early on as I did. I also learned, though, from a lot of those travels that I was in Brazil one time and was meeting with a pastor, and in the course of the conversation, he said just very flatly, "Diane, incest is just part of our culture." I did not have a file for that in my head, and have come to realize that when we live with, grow up in, breathe, see a certain thing all the time, it is what we believe is everywhere. And we don't even have a way many times to ask questions about it or to say that's wrong, because it's everywhere. And so I think that of course happens within Christendom as well, and it certainly happens within parts of Christendom, like with a particular denomination or something. This is the way that we do it. And of course it's biblical, and of course it's right. But when things are the norm, human beings do not assess. They do not self-evaluate. They do not ask questions, often because it's dangerous, and sometimes literally, but even just relationally dangerous. If you start asking questions theologically, for example, you might be disowned by a certain group of people. And so I think we don't realize what we absorb, how it shapes us, and how we don't even see it, and therefore continue it and pass it on.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could just go a little deeper into that question, actually, before I ask the next one. What are there specific things that you see in our Christian culture that we just live and breathe and don't pay attention to, that especially speak to the way we use power and how that affects issues of abuse?
Well, I think in many ways Christendom has caught the disease of culture in general, which is the way that we think about power and honor it, or covet it, or seek it, or whatever, and that power is a good thing, but it is also, we see it as an external thing, which is not how God views power. I mean, obviously he has external power, but power in Christ and in the scriptures and things in terms of our lives has to do with our character. That is how we have influence. That is how things change. That is how we love people that we don't understand, all of those things. And so I think we see, number one, people in power who have all these external things like large crowds or large buildings or large reputations or whatever, who are exceedingly articulate, those are the people with power that God has blessed. And those external things we stamp approved. We do not see the dangers in those things, and we have swallowed the medicine that says those external things are a measure of God's presence in our midst. Whereas his presence is where, in those places where we are full of humility and most like him. And I think in many ways we have lost our way in that area in the church.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. So another theme in your book is vulnerability and how that relates to power. You've defined vulnerability as, let's see, no, I'm going to read this quote. It says, vulnerability and power are intertwined, engaged in a dance that is sometimes beautiful and sometimes destructive. So can you give us some examples to help us understand the relationship between different kinds of power and vulnerability, or the capacity to be wounded? And also, what does our vulnerability, our response to vulnerability, say about us?
Well, one of the most beautiful pictures of vulnerability is a tiny baby and a mother or father who are people of integrity, who love that child, love each other, care for the child, anticipate the child's needs, comfort, all of those things. It's not hard to kill a little baby. And so that's incredible vulnerability on many, many levels, not just physically, but the way you shape the mind and the way that you shape their sense of self and all of those. And so those parents have exponential power over that child. And watching that dance, when it is done out of love and safety and care, is truly a thing of beauty. And I think gives us insight into how our Father in heaven is with us. Of course, the other side is that if the child grows up with abuse and violence and name calling and all of those things, they have no concept of safety. Children think egocentrically, so all of that's absorbed as, if I weren't such a bad kid, this wouldn't be happening. And so the life of the child is shaped into believing lies. And one of those lies, of course, is that my Father in heaven does not love me. No, because I am this person. That is what has been communicated to me. And so when people are vulnerable, we, by our response, tell them something about who we think they are. You know, my father was disabled for many years, and so I spent a good number of time in a nursing home, realizing the vulnerability of frail, elderly, and often sick human beings. And at the time, did not know that sometimes terrible abuses were happening in such places to these people. And their vulnerability, some of them not even able to articulate that something happened to them, just like the baby. So when we are confronted with vulnerability in a person of any kind, the response that we give them is an exposure of who we are. So it doesn't tell me about them. It doesn't tell me that they're frustrating me. It doesn't tell me any of those things that I might use as a reason for my abusive behavior. It tells me about myself, because what has come out of me has come from within me. And if you look at the life and choices of Jesus here with vulnerable people, people who were blind, people who were deaf, people who couldn't speak, people who were considered trash, he always responded with love and dignity for human beings. And that tells us about who he is. Many years ago, I taught a class in a seminary, and this was like a leadership class the last semester for these young men who are going on to be pastors. And we talked a little bit about vulnerable and response and what it says. And I used to say to them, if you're a pastor, you have power, whether you feel like it or not. This is not how you feel. You have it because of your position and your knowledge and all of those things. And a very distressed or disturbed young woman comes to your office, wants to see you for a session of counseling or something, and she's sitting in your office and she clearly is very broken. And you're listening to her, and all of a sudden she stands up and starts taking off all of her clothes. Talk about vulnerable. What happens next, I would say to them, tells me about you. And that's a place where human nature says, well, she or he did, therefore I. No, he or she did, and I did this because I am that.
Diane, that reminds me so much of my professor of pastoral care and the way he talked about data. You know, this is data about you, and this can be data about the other person. And so much of that, you know, as I continue to understand data from myself and raising a now 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, going through those vulnerable stages where they, you know, there is nothing that's going to appease their crying except just being there, being patient, allowing for them to just feel comforted. And so much of my response is, again, data about me. And it reminds me about the system that I grew up in, my family of origin. And so much of my training as a pastor was about the family of origin. And the next question is about systems, because your book does talk quite a bit about systems. And it talks about how as we as Christians are called to be dissidents in the corrupt systems that we find in the world. And I guess the question is, how can we recognize when a system is corrupt or abusive? Once we recognize it, how can we work towards positive change?
Well, systems, the word system means together stand. So it means a whole bunch of people standing together for some purpose or idea or goal or something. The word dissident means to sit apart. So you think back over the Soviet Union years and Solzhenitsyn and people like that, you know, you think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer during World War II in Germany. They were dissidents. They sat apart from systems that were evil and destructive. The cost was extremely high, and that's point one. You can't go up against a system, particularly if it is externally thriving, even if it's rotten to the core. If it's externally being destroyed, you will be the thing that will be destroyed if the system can manage to do that. That's what they did to Jesus. He came up against the system, both of the rabbis and things like that, the religious system, and he also came up against Rome in his teaching and his life. And they actually cooperated with each other, even though they hated each other, to put him to death. So that's a picture of what happens with systems when you try to confront them. They will crucify you if they can, or they will shut you up in any way that they can. And in Christendom, systems do that not quite so boldly as things like Bonhoeffer did, went through or whatever, but they do it by using God's words and his name. So you are a dissident, you are a bad person because you are threatening or correcting or whatever, pointing out wrong in this body that is God's. And we are doing his work in this place. And any light shining from you that would question that needs to be destroyed because you're destroying God's work. So changing systems cost a lot, are very difficult to do, often don't respond. And if they do respond and change, it's very slow. one obvious example, which we're still confronting in this country, is racism and slavery. I mean, if you really go back and study it and see how long it took for that system to actually be stopped, then it wasn't stopped in other ways. And today there are still remnants of that system that destroy lives. And there are people who have paid extremely high costs and still do today to speak the truth about the tentacles of that original system. So that's true with the church as well. And when people use God's name to protect their systems, some bell needs to go off in our heads. Because, you know, your particular church is not a child of God. The children of God are the particular people, and not the building, not the services, not the money, not the missions, all of that. It's people. And it's always people who know and love Christ and bear his likeness in their character. So you're confronting something like that, you speak out, be prepared to be run over by a Mack truck. And the point then isn't that you're going to figure out how to change the system. That would be probably grandiose on all of our parts to think. The question, the purpose is that you're speaking truth into darkness. You're calling things by their right name, which is what Jesus did. And you're inviting people to come away from what they're in and enter into that light and that truth that is found in him, not in a hateful way, not in a screaming names way and all of those things that have been done, but in invitation to him so that you are more like him around the people in the system or other people in your life.
That sounds so hard. It is.
It is.
And long.
It is.
Yes. Yeah.
If it sounds hard, you were listening.
Yes. But God is bigger than all of these things. When I was reading your book, I kept writing down quotes because there's just these little like zingers that would just kind of go, wow, that's so cool. So I love this quote. Much has been said throughout the centuries about what it means to be female. Men have said most of it. So I'm wondering if you can talk just a bit about how you see the power differential between men and women in our Christian culture.
Well, number one, the power differential and its misuse in many ways goes back to being expelled from the Garden of Eden. It's never not been here since sin entered here. And you know, you go back to creation, God says to Adam and Eve, you're in my image, which is why we have power. You know, that's where it comes from. The ability to influence and have impact come to us because part of our image of God brings power, because that's what he has. So he created us to have power. And he said to Adam and Eve, go out there in my world that I created and rule and subdue the earth, not each other. And so they did until they didn't. And then when they didn't, it got to be the rule and subdue of each other. And typically, if you read history, which is a very interesting and worthwhile thing to do, both secular and Christian, most of Christendom down through the centuries has been led by, formed by, taught by men. And in many cases, by men who had women in their lives that were not allowed to be educated, weren't allowed to read, weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed, depending on the country and the time and everything else. And so I think that that imbalance has been there, and sadly, I think sometimes often stamped godly. It is not. Women are in the image of God as much as men, and gifted by him, and we are robbing ourselves of the things that he has put in women that would help shape things in a way that might actually look a little bit more like him if we did it together than if we did it at odds with each other. But if you go back and just read the history in theology, it's almost, and I quote them in the book, it's a male voice. This is who women are. Says somebody who's never been one. Over and over again. And when you are told you are something, like as a child, you're told you're stupid for 20 years, guess what you think? You think you're stupid. And so, women have been told certain things down through theological history, and many have come to believe it. And we've lost the richness that God intended by making both of us, male and female, to work together to cause blessing to be poured out on his earth and on other people, and for his likeness to flourish in this place.
I appreciate you saying that, Diane, and I completely agree. And I also will just say I've appreciated working in partnership with Bonnie and our work as before she retires, and just the beauty that can come from working well together and being in true partnership. And we have a lot to still work on in many patriarchal systems. And I'd say that there are remnants of that in so many different ways, I think, within our systems. And hopefully one way we're doing that as a denomination is through a synodical directive to create an abusive power training. And so we've been doing that, and we are trying to get some feedback on that, are rolling that out shortly. And we've used some excerpts of your work included in this training. And we're just curious about this question. What would you recommend for pastors and church leaders to guard against any kind of abusive power?
Well, I guess the first response I would have to that is there isn't an exact way to do that. And once you figured it out, you're safe. The capacity to abuse power is in all of us and will be until we die. And so that's number one. We have to acknowledge that. One of the things I do, I think, in that chapter on men and women in the book is list some questions for males in particular in leadership to go and say, I want to know how you experience me. And secondly, it won't cost you your job. It has to be safe. There has to be a safe environment for asking those questions so you get the truth. But to ask your spouse or your daughter or your son, how do you experience me using power? How has that affected you? How has it hurt you? To ask coworkers. We usually don't even think to ask those things. And so I think that's part of it. We need to be open to people feeling safe enough to say to us, when you did so and so, that felt like you were using your power, and what I thought or felt didn't matter at all. I also think that our seminaries and training schools and all of those things, and there are some who are doing this now and doing it more, but we have to include self-evaluative measures that are meant to be lifelong in those we teach to be shepherds of some kind. Again, we don't evaluate necessarily our own culture. We don't evaluate the culture of our church or denomination typically. We don't ask questions about our impact on other people in a way that is safe for them to answer us with the truth. So there's no feedback line, except if you really mess something up, and somebody will come in and tell the pastor he really messed something up, which hardly doesn't invite him to be open to people's input. And so there's a juxtaposition of the tremendous power of being in leadership of any kind and wanting to get it right, most people do, and wanting to care for people rightly and things like that, but being terrified to be open because it's been proven not to be safe. So therefore we close down. And so I think having leaders in Christendom have the freedom to be open and to listen and to learn and all of those things is something they need to learn, something they need to be taught in training institutions. It is also something that we in the body of Christ need to take some responsibility for. How do we drive our leaders as opposed to have interest in their lives and the balance of their lives and their relationships with their families and things like that? You know, how do we demand? Are we demanding mostly external results? You know, the money's down, the people are down, you got to fix it. When in the meantime, the person may be sitting over there, dying in the middle of a terrible depression they can't tell anybody about because they'll probably lose their job if they do. And so it's a two-way street. It's not just the leaders, it's the leaders and the people together. And as the leader leads in these areas, the people can follow and do the same thing in their own arenas of power. But at the same time, the body can make it safe or unsafe for a leader to evaluate him or herself, to get feedback, go off for a month somewhere to deal with himself, herself, family, and all of those things to rejuvenate. We have demanded product and outcome, and we are helping to create leaders whose Christ-likeness is not primary to us. And we want external proof of our success for God. And unfortunately, there are leaders who are quite happy to oblige that. And so it's complicated. It doesn't rest all on the shepherds. It also rests on the sheep, because every shepherd is also a sheep.
Yeah, that also reminds me of an interview we had with Chuck DeGroat. He said, it's helpful to go to your students or to your peers and say, how do you perceive me? And ensure that that's a safe space to respond honestly. And it also reminds me of the culture of consumption that we're living in, how so many pastors feel like they are just being taken in without having a real partnership of ministry, and to do that well as the church. And so I appreciate your response.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. Wow. Yeah. Throughout your book, you weaved a theme of incarnation throughout, the way Jesus walked in the shoes of another when he came to earth. And we're called to do the same. So can you tell us why you kept coming back to that theme, and why you think it's so important to enter into the life of another, to walk in their shoes as we seek to understand abuse and the impacts of abuse?
Well, the reason it's there, and so often there, is because it has become the rock, the center point of my life. And if you had told me decades ago, and we're looking at a few decades here, just for the record, but if you had told me decades ago, when trauma wasn't even a thing counselors talked about, because there was no diagnosis, there was nothing, that I was going to enter into abuse and suffering in levels. If somebody asked me to think of the worst thing I could think of, I couldn't have come up with many of the stories that I've heard over the years. And so but if you had told me, this is what you're going to do, this is what it's going to look like, and this is going to teach you more about Jesus than you've ever learned anyplace else, I would have been mystified. There was a young therapist a long time ago who came to see me, who was early on starting as a counselor, and she had come across a handful of people with trauma histories and abuse stuff in their lives. And she said to me, I do not want to hear the stories that they bring me. And obviously that was a significant problem. So we talked about that, but it was hearing those words that sort of threw me into thinking about that. Why would somebody want to hear those stories? I mean, I was doing it, but I mean, why would I want to? And that was when I began to understand that the work that I was doing was there in part to be a safe place, help people figure things out, help them grieve, help them change, help them make other choices, all of those things. But the other person in the room that needed to learn a lot was me. Not just about trauma, which of course was true, because nobody knew anything, and I was one of those nobodies, but because learning about it would lead me to him. And it's the whole thing of the word, the words. We use words in Christendom up one side and down the other. God uses words. You read through the Old Testament, all the things that he said to his people, is words, 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 words. And guess what happened? Nobody got it. Few people did. But then the word became flesh. And that's where I have spent the last 20, 25 years in my reading and my understanding and my, for two reasons. One, my own relationship with Christ and how he keeps doing that for me and how he has done that for me and how that is meant to transform me to do that for others. I'm in that room or writing that book or speaking on that platform because I'm called by him, not just to sound like him, but to be in my life in the places where nobody sees, looking like him. And it shifted the focus. I don't have words to describe the significance of it. And I also find with people, particularly, I go back to some original cases where the trauma was just so evil and unspeakable. That was my first encounter with those kinds of stories. And of course, there was no trust in God. How could they trust in God? You know? But it was my sort of giving whiffs of him in the flesh. Just by being safe, just by saying, you know what, I'm going to put your skin on and enter your life and see what it's really like. So you know that I know. I'm not just going to tell you, I hear what you're saying and I understand, but I'm going to put your skin on. I need to, and I said this to somebody with a hideous history way back, not knowing what I was saying. Okay, I don't know anything about this. I need you to teach me what it's like to be you. That's what Jesus did. We taught him what it's like to be us. He didn't need us to do that. He figured that out. I need to do that, but he didn't need to. But we needed him to do it because then we know he knows. It all goes back to the cross ultimately. You know, that's the center point.
That's beautiful.
You sit across the worst evil you can even think of. And again, in genocide countries and whatever, you can't even comprehend it. But you will never encounter anything he did not bear. It doesn't exist. So wherever you go in those places, you will find him. Sometimes he's slow, but there's always lessons in that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's beautiful. I had a follow-up question, and I think that you being a therapist seems to give you lots of opportunities to be in that place where you are hearing those stories. People come to you to tell those stories. So a lot of us are just normal, everyday people hanging out in churches and with our friends or whatever. How do we enter into those more difficult stories? How do we create a safe place to share those so that we can become that incarnational presence of Christ in those darker places?
Well, if you think about it, just in general, in Christendom and church services or Bible studies or all those things, when you hear people talking about how humans struggle with the way they talk to each other or with immorality or whatever, and the things that we list, how many times have you heard somebody say with a history of sexual abuse or the experience of rape? Or violence in the home as a child, or even now and nobody knows. We don't put those things in our list. So nobody tells us. because we haven't even let them know we think it's out there. We're sure it's not. It's what's concluded, and actually we would like to be sure it's not. So even people in leadership and teaching positions, naming those things, and then go back to your question about male and female and all of that. How many sermons have you heard that were focused on a female in the scriptures, particularly one who was mistreated? How many sermons have you heard that teach you who God or Jesus were with that particular woman and her history? And what can we learn from what he did with that woman that we need to model? What you're doing is you're changing the story in the church. You're adding things that are in the room. I mean, the statistics are 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men are sexually abused by 18. You count that off. You think of your congregation, how many men, how many women? That doesn't count how many children have already experienced or still are. So it's sitting there. It's unspoken, it's unnamed, and we don't hear the compassion, the crossing of barriers, the bending down, the I don't care what the religious leaders say, you matter to me. All of those things about Jesus, we don't hear in the context of rape, domestic violence, whatever. And I remember years ago, a pastor asked me about that, and I said something similar to him. And he called me on the phone about 3 months later. He said, I don't know what to do. I said, what's the matter? He said, they're coming out of the woodwork. I said, well, now you get to learn more. But it's like, oh, they know it exists. They'll believe me. They won't think I'm crazy. Maybe they'll be safe.
Yeah, thank you for those words, Diane. This is a difficult conversation for many. And I know in this work, I have learned a lot. And I've appreciated being in the presence of somebody who has honored me and just sharing their story. But this continues to be a tough topic for so many people. And I'm also aware that, with our receiving feedback from our abusive power training, there are some who say, this just seems like a really hard break. It seems like this is tough, especially for somebody who's just coming out of seminary, may lack confidence. Is there anything you could, put in here that's more encouraging for those people? And I try to justify it and I go, okay, I understand. But I'm wondering also, Diane, is there any words of encouragement you can give to us as the church, and specifically also for those who care a lot about preventing and responding well to abuse?
Yes. Number one, your God sees you. He sees what you're doing. He sees your heart. He sees your longings. He sees your helping, whether it's adequate, inadequate, bumpy, whatever. He sees you and he loves you. And that will never change. And so you don't have to just get it right. If getting it right got us there, he wouldn't have died. So that's not an option. You're not going to get it right. What you want is to learn from him both about people and how to love them, and about him and how to love him more. I think also anybody in leadership is really nothing but a sheep. We differentiate somehow between shepherd and sheep, but the fact of the matter is there is only one good and great shepherd, and we're not the shepherd. We have shepherding jobs under him, but it's his flock and we're part of it. And he wants us to have rich pastures and clear waters and rest and protection from the wolves and all of those things, just as much as he wants us to help do that for his people. And I think it's very easy in doing this work And it's very easy in being in leadership to lose sight of the fact that we are sheep. And that's not a derogatory thing. It's just a truth. And if we don't live within the nature of that truth, and if we don't teach those in leadership that that's who they are and how to take care of themselves as a sheep, not just as a shepherd, and to really begin to recognize how much the good and great shepherd loves them and uses his staff to protect them, sometimes from themselves. We will either start to hide our own struggles, or we will become elevated and anxious and frantic to get it right all the time because we forget we're a sheep. And all of those things will destroy us and the work that we're doing. There's some really, I happen to like reading dead theologians. There's a lot of jokes people have made about that, but there have been many that I have read, old Scottish guys, George Matheson, G. Campbell Morgan, whatever, and some English and others, but they often talk about those kinds of things in leadership in ways that we don't anymore. And they understand that to be in leadership and do this work or any kind of shepherding with the people of God is a heartbreaking, hard work, often misunderstood and misjudged, all of those things. And yet they don't forget that you're also sheep and you need tending and caring. And we need to make sure that's taught, not just in seminaries, but in our churches, because the other sheep need to look out for the other sheep, even if they're in leadership. And we're not taught that. You know, you look out for me and you take care of yourself is pretty much the way we do it. It's dangerous, as we have seen, but it's also not God's way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had a friend once who spent time with a shepherd just so she could learn more about sheep and shepherds. Mm-hmm. And she had the most amazing stories about sheep and shepherds. We're going to turn it over to Becky now, I think, and she has a few questions. I think you've gotten a lot of questions, Becky, is that right? So we won't get to them all today, but maybe there's a few we can get to before we finish up.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative. We've received so many questions and we're going to be saving them and looking at them afterwards. So thank you for everybody that's reached out. I've had people that have been asking questions not only today, but I've also been receiving a few questions ahead of time. So Diane, many questions for you. I've sort of, as they've been coming in, I've started to categorize them a little bit just so to make them more of a bit of an umbrella conversation. So hopefully that will help us get to a couple more questions. The first one I want to address is really, there's been some questions about the church, just in terms of when you're in a challenging situation, when you're in an abusive situation within a church and you're walking away from that church, just the struggle, first of all, with having to walk away. But then I think a big question is really around, once you've walked away, what are the red flags that you should be aware of? How do you actually go back to a different church, to a safe place? How do you know how to look for that? Which is a huge challenging question, but it is one that many people have asked. So I wanted to really put that one first.
Yes, it is. And sadly, such situations cause many people not to go back. They just don't go to any other church because they don't trust churches. And when you hear some of the stories, you understand the conclusion. Plus, if it's been a church, particularly you've been a part of for a while and it's a place that you've loved, and yet you've realized there's abusive things going on and nobody's responding and it's being covered up, and so you feel like you have to leave, the grieving is huge. It's not just the church, but it's friends and things that you've done and what your children did. And so there's a lot of grieving to do. I don't put any pressure on people to go find another church. it's sort of like if you lose a spouse after 40 or 50 years or whatever of marriage, and the grieving, you know, we have this sort of idea in the West that you grieve for a neat little year and then you can skip out the door, which is ridiculous. You probably will never stop grieving about that church. Even if you do seek out some help for yourself, just to help you figure out how to grieve in a healthy way and process what you live through. And am I looking at this correctly? And are there other words for what I'm seeing besides the ones I gave them? And all of those kinds of things, which I highly recommend, because then you have a safe place to talk about it and not get it just right, and it's okay. But you also have as a companion while you grieve, and there may be people that you have in your life who are also those companions. But the grieving, it is part of God's grieving. That's not wrong. He's weeping. And you haven't left him. You've left an external system that's supposed to represent him well and didn't. And he's heartbroken. So are you. So I would just, I don't know how to answer the question about figuring it out in terms of it's different for everybody. You know, somebody can leave an abusive church and it's the third one they've left, you know, so that's they're probably not going to go anywhere for a long time, if at all, which is talk about God's grief. But your grief, your speaking truth, the damage done to you, all of those things, he knows. He's grieving. It's damaged him. He hasn't left just because you left the church. So there are places and ways, I think, to do it so that you allow yourself to go through that dark and grieving experience, but eventually learning more about who he is, which will change how you think about his external churches. And also, just for the record, when you have spoken truth to a system, no matter how awful they were to you, no matter how much they don't listen, no matter anything else, you did something that God calls you to. He's the God of truth. He doesn't like evil covered up because he knows it's a cancer. So we need to understand that those things that get all the feedback that everything you did was wrong and terrible and everything else aren't true. Aren't true. You gave them an invitation to step into the light. They rejected it. They rejected his too.
Thank you. I love that response. It's so powerful. A second question, just sort of following up to that, is if you are still in a church and you run into, and you have to be meeting up with your abuser, how do you actually manage that situation and stay safe? How do you keep yourself
Well,
safe?
Unfortunately, you're talking to a psychologist whose true response to that is to have like 15 more questions. So,
yeah.
So I'm not really sure how to answer because I don't know the answers to the 15 questions. I mean, you still have to have contact with your abuser, means something is really messed up.
Yeah.
So the question is, you know, I would want to know about the abuser. I would want to know about the events. I would want to know if there were other victims. I would want to know what the church's response is. I would want to know what is motivating the person to go to such an unsafe place. I'm not saying they have made the wrong decision. That's, you know, I'm not doing that, but I would want to understand. And I wouldn't know how to give feedback without understanding the particulars of the situation. But if you're in a church where you've been abused and your abuser is just kind of walking around and you can run into that abuser and that's that, something's really sick in the system, not just in the fact that the abuser hurt you. And I would also like to say, because this doesn't get said very often, the church has failed the abuser. We have this thing about grace and repentance that is not the way God thinks about those things. You know, yes, he's gracious, and yes, he calls to repentance, but true repentance will turn a person upside down and inside out, and they'll never be the same again. That's rare. Because if somebody cries and says they're sorry, then you have to show grace and forgive them, and then it's supposed to be fine. That's ridiculous, she said subtly. So do understand that if an abuser is just walking around in a church with where he's been abusive without restrictions or without and no way for you to know if you're going to run in, there's something really wrong that's bigger than the abuse that you got, and that was really wrong. She said with feeling.
And you had a lot of amens in the chat, so people are equaling that feeling.
Okay, sorry I missed them.
I think we probably have time for one more question. And this has been asked a few times. And there's some people that are out there that have read your book and listened to you and just recognize that people that they love are in an abusive situation. How do they help them? How do they reach out to walk alongside them? Do you have any ideas for them?
Yes. A woman who is in an ongoing abusive situation can't think well. A woman who's in an ongoing abusive situation is an adult and gets to make her choices. You know, if it's a child, you know what to do, right? Pick up the phone. You can't do that for a grown-up unless somebody's life is being threatened at gunpoint or something like that, in which case you can go talk to the police. That is also something you can do in general. If you have somebody whose life you're concerned about or whose safety in terms of her skeleton and things like that you're concerned about, you can go and talk to police oftentimes that are local, who would be the ones who would take a call if she ever made one. You don't give any names or anything like that. You don't have the option to do that. But I have a friend who lives in this area, and this is the situation. How do we get a hold of you immediately if something is really wrong? And can you make a note somewhere that if this kind of call comes in, it's real and it's really dangerous? Some people don't pay, you know, the cops are different, just like everybody's different. But most of the ones that I have known of or where people have done that, they have been very attentive. And in several systems, it has saved lives because they had a heads up. So that's one possibility. You can do that without permission because you're not giving identity. I would also suggest that if you're with, say, a woman who's living with domestic abuse of some kind, that you find the domestic abuse organizations in your town or city. They don't have to be Christian. They just need to have expertise in domestic violence and go take their training. You'll learn a tremendous amount. You'll also learn about resources you can offer your friend that might be something she would avail herself of because it's not leaving, it's doing other things. And so I think it's great for churches to go and take those trainings. You know, if you have a group of men and women who want to be involved in these situations, go take the training. Learn how to get a cell phone for somebody that can't be traced by the husband. You know, learn who to call in an instant with like one button, all of those things. So go educate yourselves, either as an individual or as a group for the sake of someone who's being abused. And the other thing is to find ways to get the person away for an hour, for a walk around the block, for whatever. So there's steady things in her life where she's safe, heard, and cared for. She may go back in the lion's den, and you will have to struggle with that. You could be the one who ends up with nightmares. It happens. But at the same time, it's her choice. So you have to honor her choice, which for the record is something the abuser does not do. So you need to honor it and you need to point out that you're doing it. But you also need to find ways to give her tastes of life and pray that they will make her hungry for more.
That's good. That goes right back into that incarnational presence again, and the message that everyone needs to hear about how loved we are by God. So
Yes.
yeah, Thank you so much. Again, we're going to end our time here today, and we just want to thank everyone for participating, for the great chats, for Diane especially, and all her wisdom that she's shared with us. And I do want to just put a quick reminder in that our next webinar will be on December 2nd. This has already been pre-recorded. We have a panel of just 2 people on the panel who are going to share some of their own experience of abuse. So we'll be able to have that practice of listening to those voices. We're calling it raising our voices, and to help us understand better what this is all about. So join us on December 2nd. And again, just thank you so much to everyone.
Last pitch for Remaining Flowers. Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church by Dr. Diane Langberg. So thank you again, Diane. And thank you, everyone.
My goodness, I don't have one.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.